Okay. This says rotate my phone again. Now I need to know if I'm right side up, because I'm not even on my phone. Let's see. Don't want my hand in your view, do you? Hi, Tim. Okay. It said rotate my phone, and I'm not on my phone. I'm on my computer. So hopefully I'm right side up, and everything looks good. And we will begin. Good, right side up. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. So we are doing this on my computer. Hopefully sound and video are decent. Not nearly as good as my phone, but having some phone issues tonight. So in order to get this done on time and make sure that we get the chapters done, I'm going to do it this way. And this is just what's going to happen. And this is just what we're going to do. So yay. Let me look through. Okay. So tonight we have chapters 5 and 6 of our book, Bunnicula, which we've been reading, obviously. So, if you, just to recall, the last we visited our friends Harold and Chester at Bunnicula and the Monroes. They had begun finding some strange-looking vegetables in the house, and most recently, a white zucchini. What could that mean? All right, Chapter 5. Chester goes into his act. The next morning, I was awakened by a scream. "Robert! Robert! Come down here right away! There's something wrong in the kitchen!" For a moment, panic seized me. I thought she'd run out of dog food, but then I remembered the events of the previous evening. Mr. Monroe came bounding down the stairs. "Chester! Chester!" I cried. "Did you see Mr. Monroe? His face had turned white. It's Bunnicula, isn't it?" "No," he said calmly. "It's the shaving cream, you idiot." By now, the excitement in the kitchen was at full throttle. The table was covered with Bunnicula's handiwork. There were white beans and white peas and white squash and white tomatoes and white lettuce and white zucchini. "What can it mean, Robert?" Mrs. Monroe was saying. "I'm getting worried. One tomato is a curiosity, but this is unheard of." "There must be something wrong with our refrigerator. That's it. It's turning all the vegetables white." "But look," she said. "I left these tomatoes on the windowsill, and they're white too. And this squash I left in a bowl on the table." At that moment, Pete and Toby came into the kitchen. "Holy cow! What's going on?" "Hey, maybe it's a vegetable blight, Mom." "Could that be, Robert? Did you ever hear of anything like this?" "Well, no, actually. That is, I've heard of blight, but nothing like this." Chester leaned my way. "This will take forever if we leave it up to them. Sometimes human beings can be so slow." I started to answer him, but he was headed for the table. "What about that friend of yours in the agriculture department?" "Oh, Tom Cragen." "Could we call him and ask him if we're doing something wrong?" "It's DDT, Mom," Peter interjected. "I know about this stuff. It's because you buy vegetables that aren't organic." "All vegetables are organic, Peter," Mrs. Monroe replied. "That's not what my teacher says. See, Toby, I told you this would happen. They're using chemicals on our food, and if you're not careful, you'll turn white too." "Like Dad?" "Robert, couldn't you take that shaving cream off your face?" "Oh, yes, of course. Where's my towel? I know I brought it down with me." For that matter, where was Chester? I'd seen him going toward the table, but I'd lost track of him listening to all the talk about DDT. I just hoped that they didn't use any of that stuff where they grew chocolate cupcakes. "Pete, did you take my towel?" "Why would I take your towel, Dad? I don't shave." Just then, the door swung open. I could not believe my eyes. There was Chester, with Mr. Monroe's towel draped around his back and tied under his neck like a cape. That was strange enough, but on his face was an expression that sent chills down my spine. His eyes were wide and staring. The corners of his mouth were pulled back in an evil grimace. His teeth were bared and gleaming in the morning light. He cackled menacingly and threw back his head as if he were laughing at all of us. I thought he'd gone completely mad. "There's my towel. What's the matter, Chester? Were you cold?" Mr. Monroe bent down to take the towel from Chester. Before he could lay his hands on it, Chester flipped over onto his back, closed his eyes, and folded his paws on his chest. It was a hideous sight. He opened his eyes wide, with paws outstretched. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes glazed and vacant. Soon the upper half of his body followed, all in one smooth flow until he was in a sitting position. "Hey, Dad, did you leave your brandy glass out last night? Chester's acting a little weird." "Well, son, cats are funny creatures." I glanced at Chester. He wasn't laughing. "Psst, Chester, what are you doing?" "I'm a vampire, you dolt. Can't you tell? I'm trying to warn them." "Well, it's not working. You'd better think of something else." Chester frowned, apparently deep in thought. "So you see, Toby," Mr. Monroe was explaining, "all cats are as individual as people. Maybe he just wants to get our attention. Isn't that right, Kitty Cat?" Ordinarily, Chester would have left the room upon being called Kitty Cat, but he was lost in thought. "Come on, Chester, give me back my towel." Mr. Monroe moved towards Chester. Chester's eyes lit up. He looked at me and smiled. I sensed I was not going to like what he had in mind. I was toying with the notion of slinking under the table when Chester fixed me with his eyes. How deep they were, how like black pools. I felt myself floating, lost in them, my will no longer my own. I felt an inexplicable urge to murmur, "Yes, master," when he slowly walked towards me, steadily. As he drew nearer, I found myself unable to move. He stopped before me, never taking his gaze from me, and lunged. "Yow! Mom, Chester bit Harold on the neck." "Aw, that wasn't a real bite, was it, Chester?" "That was a love bite. Isn't it cute?" "Love bite my foot? That hurt." "Chester, what's the matter with you?" I sputtered. "Do I look like a tomato?" "Oh, it doesn't matter anyway, Harold. They don't understand. How can human beings read the same books I do and still be so thick?" Our conversation was interrupted. Mrs. Monroe picked Chester up and cuddled him. I was praying she would not add insult to injury by kissing his nose, which he hates more than anything. "Poor Chester. Do you need a little love? Do you know what I'm going to do, you big ball of fuzz, you?" Oh, I could tell what was coming up. "I'm going to kiss you on your little nose." Yep, I could tell that was coming. Chester knew better than to resist. He went limp in Mrs. Monroe's arms. Mr. Monroe took his towel from Chester. "I still don't know why he's wearing my towel," he said. "I think he must be cold, dear. Here's your towel. Why don't you get his kitty sweater?" Chester looked ill, and he can wear that all day. As Chester was being buttoned up in his bright yellow sweater with little purple mice and cowboy hats all over it, Mr. Monroe said, "What about those vegetables? Shall I speak to Tom Cregan?" "Yes, dear," Mrs. Monroe said. "Why don't you? I'm sure there's some explanation. In the meantime, I'll change markets. To tell you the truth, I'm really much more worried about Chester. We better keep our eye on him." Chester and I did not speak until late afternoon. I was busy nursing my neck, and Chester was busy hiding under the sofa, too embarrassed to be seen. When we did speak at last, it was a brief exchange. "Hey, Chester," I called when he finally crawled out from under. "We don't have to worry about any vampire bunnies anymore. All you have to do is stand outside his cage in that sweater, and he'll laugh himself to death." Chester was not amused. "That's right. Make fun, all of you. No one understands. I tried to warn them, and they wouldn't heed. Now I'm going to take matters into my own hands." Whereupon Chester and his 16 purple mice went into the kitchen for dinner. Chapter 6. Harold Helps Out. That night I had an uneasy sleep. Strange noises emanated from downstairs. It sounded like toenails clicking back and forth on the floor. It must be Bunnicula making his midnight run, I thought, although I'd never known him to make a sound. And I smelled the funniest odor in the air, something familiar, though I couldn't place it. As the night progressed, it grew stronger and stronger, until finally it tickled my nose, and I sneezed myself awake. I jumped off Toby's bed, still sniffling, and headed down the stairs for the living room to find Chester, to see if he could smell it too. The odor grew even stronger as I approached the living room. Standing in the doorway was Chester, a strange pendant hanging from his neck. "Phew, Chester," I said. "What are you wearing that awful thing for? It smells." "Of course it smells," he replied. "Here, I made one for you too. Put it on." "Are you kidding? Oh, that thing smells like garlic." "It is garlic," Chester stated matter-of-factly. "Why are you wearing garlic?" I asked, thinking that by this time Chester was capable of anything. As we walked into the living room, I tripped over another piece of garlic lying on the doorway. "Careful," said Chester. "Watch your step." I surveyed the room and saw that it was strewn with garlic. On the doorways, over the windows, and around Bunnicula's cage. The poor little fellow had buried his nose as far as possible under the blanket. I was about to follow his example and return to Toby's bed to bury my nose under the blankets when Chester grabbed my tail with his teeth. "You're not leaving this room until you put this on," he grumbled at me. I think that's what he said. I wasn't sure because he had my tail in his mouth. "It's not polite to talk with your mouth full, Chester. Drop that tail." Meanwhile, my eyes were beginning to water. "Listen," Chester snapped at me, fortunately letting go of my tail first. "The book said to use garlic." "What book? The Joy of Cooking?" Chester continued. "The mark of the vampire says garlic renders vampires immobile." "What does that even mean?" "It means they can't go anywhere if there's garlic around." "Well, I've got news for you, Chester. I can't go anywhere either. The smell is killing me." "But you've got to put it on. It says so in the book. If you don't put it on, I'll put it on for you." "Oh, Chester," I said, my nose suddenly and involuntarily closing. "I'd be living in this room now, and I'd be leaving this room now." And I did. I was so sick to my stomach from the aroma that I decided to spend the early morning hours outdoors. As dawn approached, it seemed that it would be a peaceful day. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and I felt contented after my difficult night just lying on the grass, feeling the ladybugs crawling in my ears. Suddenly, the calm was broken. Strange, piercing screams came from the area of the kitchen. Not again, I thought. What turned white now? As it happened, it was Chester. There in the sink, lathered with soap, was a feline detective yelling his head off. Mrs. Monroe was scrubbing him vigorously, and, from the sound of her voice, was in the middle of a long lecture. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Chester. You've never played with garlic before. I thought you hated the smell of it, and here you've gotten it all over yourself. Stop wriggling. You'll get soap in your eyes. If you want to chew on something, I'll get you some catnip, but stay out of my herbs." Then she rinsed him off, rubbed him with a towel, and plunked him down in front of the stove to finish drying. "Shut the door," he hissed at me. "I'm freezing. That silly woman, doesn't she know cats don't get baths?" "What do you mean?" I get baths all the time, I said, closing the door with my back foot.
That's because you're too dumb to bathe yourself. Cats always bathe themselves. It's a rule. Everyone knows that.
Well, at least it smells nice in here again, I sniffed as I settled down next to Chester by the stove. And it's all toasty warm here in the kitchen.
Sure, it smells nice again, he said, but now the house isn't safe anymore.
What do you mean? I asked, getting closer.
I mean, it worked last night. The garlic worked. No more vegetables turned white, did they?
No, but
that means Bunnicula didn't get out of his cage last night.
Well, maybe he was just tired, I said, or maybe he was full.
Don't be ridiculous, he replied. It was the garlic. He couldn't leave his cage. But tonight he'll be free to roam again, and I've got to find a way to stop him that isn't as smelly.
Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were hurrying in and out of the room, stepping over us late for work. Mrs. Monroe yelled up to Toby, "Don't forget to take the steak out of the freezer when you get home today, Toby, and leave it on the table to defrost. And this time, remember to put a plate under it." Chester's ears perked up.
"Of course," he said. "That's what I'll do."
And he strolled past me with a knowing smile. Mrs. Monroe turned off the stove and left the room. It was too much for me to figure out, so I went to sleep on the nice, warm kitchen floor. I was awakened by a bite on the ear. Chester was sitting by me, looking very impatient.
"Boy, nothing wakes you up," he said. "I've been yelling and poking at you for 10 minutes.
I was dreaming, I answered, defensively, about a place where there weren't any cats around to bother nice dogs and wake them up when they needed their rest.
"You can finish sleeping later," he said, crisply. "Right now, you have to help me."
"Do what?" I asked.
"Get Bunnicula out of the cage."
I sprang back. "Get him out of the cage? I thought that's what you didn't want. I thought you said he was dangerous. What if he attacks me?"
"Aren't you ashamed?" Chester replied. "Afraid of a harmless little bunny?"
"Harmless? I thought you said he was the threat of the house and everyone in it. Isn't that what you said? Isn't that what we've been talking about this whole time?"
"He is a threat, but only at night. During the day, he's just a very sleepy little rabbit, and that's why we have to do it now, while the sun is up. Follow me," he said. "There isn't much time. Toby stayed down here forever, and the others will be home soon. Boy, you must be tired, Harold. You slept through lunch."
I followed Chester into the living room. My heart was pounding as he unlocked the cage door with his paw. It looked as if he had had years' experience opening locks. The door swung open. Bunnicula was sleeping peacefully. He did, however, look a little green around the gills, probably from the garlic. I was just wondering how a rabbit could have gills, when Chester said,
"Okay, Harold, do your stuff while I get what I need from the kitchen."
"Well, what do you want me to do? I can't read your mind."
"Get him out of the cage and onto the floor, and I'll be right back," Chester said.
"What? What? What?" I verbalized. "How am I supposed to do that?"
"Use your head," he answered,
and he was gone. Looking at the cage, I realized that was precisely what I would have to do. Until this moment, I had never had to face the possibility of actual physical contact with a real live rabbit. I looked upon the chore reluctantly. I seemed to recall my grandfather telling me that one picked a rabbit up by the neck with one's teeth. This I attempted, though the very idea set my stomach churning. I squeezed my head through the tiny door and gently placed my teeth around the skin of the bunny's neck. To avoid any suggestion of violence, I've never been one for sportive hunting. I preferred to think of myself as the creature's mother, carrying it safely. Unfortunately, I couldn't carry it anywhere, for once my head was in the cage, it wouldn't come back out again. I could go neither forward nor backward. At that moment, Chester appeared at the door, carrying in his mouth what looked every bit like a nice big, juicy, raw steak. My eyes popped, my teeth dropped Bunnicula, my mouth opened, and I began to drool. After all, I had missed lunch. "Chester, what are you doing with that steak?"
"Haven't you gotten him out of there yet?"
"I can't get either of us out of here. My head's stuck."
"Oh, Harold, sometimes I despair. Here, I'll get you both out. I should have done everything myself."
He came over, dropped the steak just a few feet away from me, and climbed onto my shoulders.
"You pull your head out while I push against the cage."
"Who gets the steak?" I asked.
"Don't worry about the steak, Harold. Just pull."
"I would have more motivation if I knew who got the steak." Chester ignored me. I pulled, he pushed. I felt something go pop. We all fell in a jumble. Chester, the cage, Bunnicula, and me. When I looked around, Bunnicula was lying next to me, still sound asleep. "There you are," I said. "We got him out. Now let's eat."
"No dice," Chester said. "Just read this to me so I'll be sure I'm doing it right."
And he handed me a book. That book. Again.
"Start at the top of the page," Chester said, as he picked up the steak.
"Why don't you read, and I'll hold the steak?" Chester replied. I took it to mean that I was to start reading. "To destroy the vampire and end his reign of terror, it is necessary to pound a sharp steak." Chester interrupted.
"A sharp steak," he said. What does that mean?"
"I'll taste it, and I'll tell you if it's sharp," I offered.
Ugh, never mind. This will do. It's sirloin. Keep reading."
"To pound a sharp steak into a vampire's heart, this must be done during the daylight hours when the vampire has no powers."
"Okay," he said. "This is it. I'm sorry I had to go this far, but if they'd listened, this wouldn't have been necessary."
He dragged the steak across the floor and laid it across the inert bunny. Then, with his paws, he began to hit the steak. "Are you sure that's what they mean, Chester?"
"Am I anywhere near his heart?"
he asked. It's hard to tell," I said. "All I can really see are his nose and his ears, you know. He's really sort of cute." Chester was getting that glint in his eye again. He was pounding away at the steak, harder and harder. "Be careful," I cried. "You're going to hurt him." Chester increased his attack. I was really getting worried when the door opened and Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were suddenly with us in the room. "Chester!" Mrs. Monroe screamed. "What are you doing with my dinner? Robert, get that steak away from Chester. And what's the matter with Bunnicula? Why is he on the floor?" Mr. Monroe took the beautiful steak away. I wished it a fond farewell with tears in my eyes as the kitchen door swung open. Chester whispered with cold determination, "All right, last resort," and dashed into the kitchen. Seconds later, he was back, carrying his water dish between his teeth. He ran towards Bunnicula with a mad yowl, threw the dish of water at the rabbit. Unfortunately, he was so hysterical that his aim was not the best. With water dripping from my ears, I watched Mrs. Monroe pick Chester up by the scruff of the neck and toss him unceremoniously out the front door. "Robert, we're going to have to do something about that cat. Look at this mess. Dinner's ruined, the poor bunny is out of the cage, and Harold is sopping wet." I tried to look as pathetic as I knew how. "Aw, poor Harold," Mrs. Monroe cooed as she dried me off. "You've had a rough day. You and Bunnicula. I don't know what's the matter with your friend, but unless he learns how to behave, he'll just have to spend the night outside." Mr. Monroe, meanwhile, has returned Bunnicula to his cage, and the cage to the windowsill. I couldn't believe it when I saw that Bunnicula was still asleep. "Anne," Mr. Monroe said, "the steak is ruined. Why don't we let Harold have it? He deserves a treat anyway, don't you, old boy?" I panted appropriately. After my delicious dinner, I turned my attention to the book still laying on the floor. "Another method of destroying the vampire is to immerse the body in water," The body will then shrivel and disappear as the vampire emits one last scream of terror. Phew, I thought so. So that's what he was trying to do. Thank goodness he missed. I had no regrets about missing a scene like that. Poor Bunnicula. I looked over toward the cage, and there on the other side of the window was a pathetic, tabby face looking in. His little nose was pressed against the window. Couldn't hear him, but from the movements of his lips, I could see he was very unhappy. Oh, poor Chester. As for me, Mrs. Monroe spent the evening petting me, and the family chatted with me all night. And so, of course, I had my yummy steak dinner. So it wasn't a bad day after all. Except that now my steak was all gone. Poor Harold. And there's a picture of poor Chester looking in the window from the outs. And there you go. That is the end of the 6th chapter. We have, I think, let me see, how many more do we have? I think there are 9 chapters. There are 9 chapters. So next Sunday, we will read chapters 7, 8, and 9. The last 3 chapters are actually much shorter. So we should be able to get through 7, 8, 9, which is about that much, all next Sunday at 8 o'clock. So thank you guys for joining. I hope you enjoyed it. It's here if you want to watch it again from the beginning. Sorry for the beginning being a little weird. We've had some technical difficulties here. But yeah, so then after we're done with Bunnicula, I'm going to start another short book. So we'll probably just do 1 book the Sunday after. But I hope you all have a fantastic week and a wonderful Halloween on Wednesday. I hope you all get to dress up and go to Halloween parties and have lots of fun. My husband and I are going down to see Postmodern Jukebox in concert. So that will be our Halloween. But I wish you all a happy, safe Halloween, a wonderful week, and I'll see you next Sunday. Bye, guys.